Nobody expected a quiet church land dispute to erupt into a full courtroom showdown, yet that is exactly where Bishop Winans now finds himself, standing in the middle of a legal storm that no one saw coming, a storm built not from scandal or moral failure, but from decades of buried misunderstandings, conflicting memories, and long-standing expectations tied to a piece of land that meant far more to the congregation than simple property lines could ever explain. And as this once private dispute spilled into public view, the documents submitted to the court revealed details that shocked even the most loyal supporters, sparking conversations, concern, and confusion throughout the entire community, because what surfaced next didn't just raise questions, it opened a floodgate of deeper issues the church never imagined it would have to confront. To understand how Bishop Winans ended up in such a position, we must go back to the very beginning, to the moment when this conflict was still just a whisper in church hallways, a quiet disagreement that many believed would resolve itself with a single conversation, a handshake, and clarity. But this case was different from the start, because the land in question wasn't just land. It carried family history, emotional ties, decades-old promises, and layers of informal agreements that were never fully written down but were deeply respected by those who believed they understood how things had always been. Some longtime members insisted that promises were made years earlier. Others argued that decisions were rushed without enough transparency, and as emotions rose, memories clashed, and people recalled events differently, a simple question, who officially controls this land, slowly grew into a disagreement too complex for private meetings to fix. Tension built as multiple voices inside the congregation began sharing competing versions of what they believed happened, each version shaped by personal experience, assumptions, and interpretations of conversations from years earlier. Some insisted everything had been handled properly, others felt they had been left out of critical decisions, and as these conflicting accounts spread, frustration grew until one path remained: allow the court to examine the documents, timelines, and signatures to determine the truth. But that legal filing triggered a turning point no one expected. The moment the dispute entered the courtroom, the tone shifted completely, because courts deal not with emotions or church traditions or verbal agreements passed from generation to generation, but with dates, signatures, deeds, and hard facts. And inside those filings were details that caught nearly everyone off guard. Timelines that didn't match the congregation's assumptions, agreements older than anyone realized, missing signatures that many believed had long been completed, and references to prior discussions and verbal understandings that had never been recorded formally. Suddenly, people who had never even glanced at a land deed were studying every line, every date, every margin note, trying to understand how the church had suddenly become entangled in a legal web. Some members felt validated by what they saw, others were confused, and some were stunned that the issue had escalated into something so public, especially when it involved a leader as respected as Bishop Winans. All the while, the bishop maintained that the situation was being misunderstood, that the public narrative was distorting the facts. But then came the most shocking moment yet. The court requested additional documents. That request alone sent shockwaves through the congregation, signaling that the first set of filings were not entirely clear, that something significant was missing, and that the court needed more information before making any ruling. This was when the atmosphere around the church shifted dramatically, from concern to tension, from tension to outright urgency. Families who had attended the church for decades were now openly discussing the situation in hallways, parking lots, and community meetings, realizing that something much bigger was unfolding beneath the surface. When the new documents were reviewed, a series of simple yet surprising details emerged. Old land references that predated many current members, notes about shared use agreements that had never been publicly discussed, and explanations showing that some decisions were made out of immediate necessity rather than long-term planning. For some, these revelations made sense. For others, they deepened the mystery. But what shocked many was the discovery that this dispute didn't start with Bishop Winans at all. Several documents suggested that informal questions surrounding the land had been quietly circulating years, sometimes decades, before he ever entered leadership. Suddenly, what the public had framed as a new controversy began to look like a long-standing issue that simply reached a breaking point on his watch. Then came the recollections of early community leaders who had been involved in the original discussions. Some believed the land had always been intended solely for church use, while others remembered conversations hinting at shared control or future expansion plans. And these conflicting memories only added more layers to an already complicated story. All of this, every document, every revelation, every discrepancy, led the congregation into an unavoidable conversation, one that went far beyond land ownership, a conversation about communication, transparency, historical memory, leadership responsibility, and the assumptions communities carry without written records to anchor them. And now, with the court still reviewing evidence and the congregation bracing for what comes next, one thing has become clear. This was never just about land. It was about legacy, trust, history, and the unintended consequences of decisions made long before anyone realized how important they would become. As this story continues, the question everyone is asking remains the same. What will the court uncover next? And how will it reshape not just the land dispute but the future of Bishop Winans' ministry and the church itself? As more people dug into their memories, the entire situation surrounding the church land dispute grew increasingly complex, evolving from a simple disagreement into a tangled web of history, personal perspectives, and informal agreements that had never been properly documented, creating an emotional divide within the congregation as members struggled to reconcile what they believed with what was now surfacing publicly. Some rushed to defend Bishop Winans immediately, insisting he had simply inherited a problem that began long before his leadership, while others believed the court's involvement was necessary to finally bring clarity, even if the truth proved uncomfortable. And a quieter group remained caught in the middle, unsure who to believe or how the church had reached such a complicated and painful point. Yet the most shocking detail wasn't hidden in deeds, signatures, or paperwork. It came from the reaction of those closest to the situation, a reaction that made longtime members pause and question everything they thought they understood. When the court's request for additional clarification became public, a new voice stepped forward. Someone connected to the broader faith community who had been observing the dispute quietly from a distance, and with a single question, they shifted the conversation in a direction no one expected. They asked, simply, who was responsible for reviewing the land agreements before any decisions were made? It was not accusatory, not defensive, yet it struck the room like thunder, because no one, neither trustees, nor leaders, nor committee members, had ever publicly explained that crucial detail. This question cracked open a door the congregation had hoped would remain closed, redirecting attention away from the documents themselves and toward the process, the meetings no one remembered clearly, the approvals that may or may not have been finalized, the conversations held behind closed doors decades earlier. Suddenly, members weren't just wondering what happened. They were wondering how it had happened and whether critical steps had been missed or misunderstood long before the current dispute reached the courtroom. As discussions spread through the church, memories resurfaced in waves. Some longtime members recalled meetings where land usage was mentioned briefly but never explained. Others remembered a committee assigned to property issues that never completed its report. A few admitted they had assumed everything was resolved years ago, simply because no one told us otherwise. These memories did not prove wrongdoing, but they intensified the emotional weight of the conflict, turning concern into frustration as members grappled with the idea that silence, assumptions, and gaps in communication had contributed as much to the conflict as any legal technicality. Tension rose as some insisted church leadership had acted properly, while others believed better communication could have prevented the legal battle entirely. For the first time, the spotlight widened beyond Bishop Winans, illuminating decades of administrative choices, record-keeping habits, and shared responsibility. Meanwhile, the court's request for clearer documentation raised new questions. If these records were unclear, what else might still be hidden? Would older records clarify the dispute or reveal deeper complications no one was prepared to confront? Then came the next twist. Reports indicated that individuals who had been involved long before the current leadership, including retired committee members and possibly even previous landowners, might be called to clarify their memories. This possibility sent ripples of concern throughout the congregation, because once former decision-makers step into the case, the story inevitably grows more layered, emotional, and personal. And just as the church struggled to absorb this new reality, another development pushed the situation from internal tension to citywide attention. What happened next expanded the issue far beyond the church walls. As the dispute continued to unfold, the broader community began to take notice. What started as an internal matter now spilled into public view as local residents, community leaders, and even small media outlets became curious. This wasn't because people sought drama, but because the case reflected something bigger than land boundaries. It touched on trust, leadership, transparency, and the future of a respected congregation with deep roots in the community. The first sign of growing outside interest appeared online when community members posted simple questions like, "What is happening with the church land? Why is Bishop Winans involved in a legal case? Is the property in danger?" These posts spread quickly as more people joined the conversation. Former residents, longtime neighbors, Individuals who remembered the land's early history, decades-old stories resurfaced, adding yet more layers to the already complicated puzzle. Local media soon noticed the rising curiosity. Their coverage wasn't sensationalized. Instead, it reflected genuine interest in understanding how a respected bishop and a historic congregation had become entangled in a legal battle. Articles and reports began highlighting the broader implications, how the outcome might affect community land use, historical preservation, and even the church's future growth. And through it all, the congregation watched in real time as their private struggle transformed into a public story, drawing eyes far beyond those who sit in their pews every Sunday. Suddenly, this wasn't just a land dispute, it had transformed into a multi-layered conflict involving history, memory, process, leadership, and community identity. And as the court continued its review, everyone, both inside and outside the church, began to wonder what the next revelation would be and how much deeper this story would go before the truth finally came to light. As discussions widened and more people recalled forgotten details, the entire land dispute grew increasingly layered, revealing complexities far deeper than anyone in the congregation initially imagined. Some spoke passionately about the church's long legacy. Others reflected on how land disputes had shaken religious institutions in the past, and while the tone remained cautious, the attention was undeniable, sparking a wave of mixed emotions inside the sanctuary walls. Some welcomed the public interest, believing outside attention might finally bring clarity, while others worried it could invite misunderstanding, embarrassment, or speculation that might harm the church's reputation if the situation wasn't handled with care. Yet the greatest effect of this community spotlight was the pressure it placed on everyone involved to move faster, communicate more clearly, and provide transparency like never before. Because when the public becomes curious, expectations shift, and people want updates, facts, reassurance, and most importantly, certainty. This growing spotlight aligned almost perfectly with the court's next request, a new round of clarifications, not because the church was necessarily at fault, but because the story had become more tangled as new details surfaced. And the judge now wanted cleaner timelines, clearer documentation, and a comprehensive explanation of who held authority over what and when, signaling that the case wasn't winding down. It was entering a more intense, more detailed phase. As the court prepared to review these updates, the congregation waited, tension hanging in the air like a quiet storm cloud. And during this waiting period, another unexpected development emerged. Reports surfaced that the land itself was more complex than previously assumed, containing outdated survey lines, historical structures, past ownership layers, and possible easements that hadn't been publicly discussed in years, details that might seem small individually but collectively could reshape the court's entire interpretation of the dispute. Immediately, members began whispering, if the land had hidden complications, what else might come to light? Were there past agreements no one remembered? Could these features tilt the case in one direction or another? For many, this was the moment they finally understood the weight of what the church was facing. This wasn't just a simple property misunderstanding. It was a story with history, depth, and unexpected corners, a story far larger than anyone anticipated when the issue first surfaced. Yet just as the congregation tried to absorb this revelation, another major development shifted the tone dramatically and pulled Bishop Winans himself into the direct center of the storm. Until now, much of the conflict revolved around the property's past, its history, prior agreements, and the administrative process. But the judge's latest request required something only he could provide, a formal explanation outlining the precise sequence of decisions surrounding the land. This wasn't punishment or accusation. It was a procedural step meant to help the court understand who approved what, who oversaw specific negotiations, and how various choices had evolved over time. But because Bishop Winans was the head of the congregation, the responsibility naturally fell to him. And once the news spread, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Some members shrugged it off as a normal legal necessity, while others felt uneasy, wondering why the judge needed to hear directly from the bishop and whether the case was deeper than they had believed. Supporters quickly rallied behind him, insisting he had always acted in the church's best interest, and pointing out that any confusion likely came from inherited problems, outdated paperwork, or historical documents that predated his leadership. Their message was simple and unwavering: let the truth come out, there is nothing to hide. Meanwhile, many members, those neither defensive nor suspicious, hoped this step would finally bring clarity after months of uncertainty, believing that hearing the bishop's perspective would help them understand the decisions made and the reasoning behind them. Outside the church, however, the reaction was immediate. Community members, local journalists, and casual observers who had followed the case from afar now leaned in closer. not expecting scandal, but recognizing that when a leader of Bishop Winans' prominence is asked to submit formal clarification, the moment is significant. Leadership accountability always draws public interest, and this attention created new challenges for the church. It now had to balance transparency with privacy, maintain unity while addressing questions openly, and brace for the possibility that more documents, testimonies, or historic records might surface as the court dug deeper. Then came yet another twist. As the bishop prepared to submit his explanation, individuals connected to earlier eras of church leadership, people who had held roles long before he arrived, stepped forward offering information they believed might help. Some provided handwritten notes from old meetings, some shared summaries or recollections of early land discussions, and others offered memories of conversations from decades past. Their contributions weren't meant to choose sides but to widen the court's understanding of the land's complicated history. This influx of information brought both relief and concern. Relief because the court might finally have the full picture, and concern because the situation was now undeniably broader and more layered than the current congregation ever realized. And as these documents were reviewed, sorted, and prepared for submission, yet another shift occurred, one that catapulted the case into its most intense, unpredictable phase yet. Speculation grew louder, emotions ran higher, and with every passing day, it became clearer that the outcome of this dispute would not only determine the future of the land, it would shape the future of the church, its leadership, its unity, and its place within the community far beyond what anyone imagined when the first questions arose.